So we talked about how men are vastly overrepresented in the commission of index offenses. The next thing we want to talk about is the age structure of criminal offending. And what we see is that crime is also an enterprise that is committed by young people. Youth ages 13 to 17, young teenagers, make up 6% of the population, but they account for 25% of index offenses. That's 4 times their share. By contrast, people 45 and over are 32% of the population, but only account for about 7% of the crime. The elderly are about 12% of the population, and they account for 1% of index arrests. Most criminologists talk about the ages from 15 to 24 as the crimogenic years. So when you look at all of those crimes that we listed for the UCR index offenses, think about the fact that these crimes are committed primarily by people ages 15 to 24. This chart shows offender rates by age. Age is along the horizontal x-axis, and offender rates are on the vertical axis, and it disaggregates these offender rates by gender. And as you can see, men have dramatically higher crime rates than women, which we already knew, but you can see that even within and between genders, the offender rate is far, far higher in the teens and early 20s, and then along about age 30 or so, you see rather precipitous decline. So the peak age for property crime, the modal age for a property crime, is just 16. For violence, it's a little bit older, about 18. And what we see is that most people tend to age out of crime. Criminologists call it the age-out effect, or they call it the desistance phenomenon. And that is the idea that very few people persist into crime into their 30s. Most convicted adult offenders have a juvenile history, but most juvenile histories don't go on to have an adult record. And this is one of the most interesting things about criminology, because the same kind of questions come up about why this is the case. For instance, think about the link that we presume between poverty and crime. People, older people are still in poverty. People that are in poverty in their 20s are often still in poverty in their 30s, and yet they seem to be committing a lot less crime. So this age effect seems to run counter to some of the things that we think of as being catalysts for crime. Now, this has some important policy implications as well. We've talked about the rate of incarceration. We've talked about the fact that people are in prison for longer sentences. People are more likely to be sent to prison now for certain crimes than they were a couple generations ago. And so what you see is that people are aging in prison, and you have an increasing share of prisoners that are over the age of 50, that are over the age of 60, and geriatric prisoners are very expensive. The health care for old people is expensive. And so many experts in the criminal justice system look at this situation and say, things are backwards in terms of what makes fiscal sense. So one of the things that you see is that as people get older and they amass a more extensive criminal history, their sentences get longer and longer and longer. But those people are, even high-rate offenders, are primed to stop committing crimes, to age out of crimes when they hit their 30s. And so they are sentenced for their longest stint in prison at the very time when evidence shows they're least likely to be recidivists. And so all of these 50-year-olds that are in prison are probably not going to be a danger to society if they're let out. So, and you can say, well, they deserved what they got, and that's fine, and I wouldn't argue with that. But in terms of how we're spending tax dollars, I mean, students don't think a lot about how much money we're spending on prison. And with respect to how we spend our tax dollars, prisons are extremely expensive, and you have all of these people in jail that are costing us all this money to house them and all this money for their health care as they age. And so a lot of criminologists say, it would be smarter to give people who are 18 or 19 a longer prison sentence first, so that they can spend more of their time in prison when they're more likely to recidivate upon getting out. This is something that criminal justice practitioners think about. Now, why? Why is it the case that people tend to stop committing crime as they age? Well, one theory is that people are well aware of the criminal justice system, and they fear crime and its consequences. And so what happens is that a juvenile knows he or she will not be severely punished if they commit a crime, and they go to the juvenile court. But when you turn 18, then suddenly it can be a big problem. So, for instance, if I'm a juvenile and I'm arrested with a couple hits of LSD, nothing really bad is going to happen to me, and my record will be sealed. I'll get probation. There'll probably be some intervention, but I mean, it's not going to be anything close to what happens to me when I'm 18 years old and I'm arrested with LSD, and then I become a felon, and I have a criminal record for the rest of my life. So some people have postulated that what happens is people get older, they are aware of the changing consequences, they fear those consequences, and so they stop committing crimes. That might explain some of it, but there are still, if you go back and look at the chart, there's still substantially high crime rates for people that are in their early 20s. Recall that violence peaks at 18. That's the modal year. So 19, 20-year-olds, they still have high rates of violent crime. So that probably doesn't explain all of it. Other people say that what happens is that as you get older, you become more tied to conventional institutions. And being tied to these conventional institutions circumscribes the opportunities to commit crime. So, for instance, when men who are committing these crimes reach their mid-20s or their late 20s, they tend to settle down a little bit. Maybe they get married or they have a girlfriend. And, a girlfriend or a wife is just not going to put up with you hanging out with your buddies every night. Marriage tames men down, so the theory goes. And so what ends up happening is that when men enter that phase of their life, they sort of mature out of crime because they shift from, a single guy out with the boys to a family man or a married man or a man that has a girlfriend that is a long-term relationship. The other thing is that, when you're a 25-year-old can get a better job than an 18-year-old just by virtue of being 25. So the kind of job that I can get when I'm 16, 17, 18 years old is the kind of job where I really don't care if I lose it. All right. So, I work at Wendy's and they say they're going to drug test me. And if I test positive for THC, they're going to fire me. Well, I really don't care, because if they fire me at Wendy's, I can start at Burger King, the day after tomorrow. Those kinds of jobs are easy to get. They don't pay anything. They're crappy. And so I like marijuana more than my job. But if I'm 25 years old and I have a better paying job and it has some benefits and it has steady hours where I know I have weekends off, or, it's the kind of thing where I want to build it into a career, then if the company tells me, if we drug test you and you test positive, you get fired, at that point I might say to myself, maybe I should think about quitting smoking marijuana rather than putting this job at risk. And so this is what we mean when we say people have are tied to conventional institutions. People have a stake in conformity. And that happens as people get older. And of course, just as with gender, We have essentialist explanations that try and explain the crime decline with age as well. In the last video, we talked about the link between testosterone and aggression. And here you can see that testosterone declines with age as well. And so if it is the case that testosterone is a catalyst for aggression, which is linked to violent crime or risk-taking, or the kinds of behaviors that are going to land you in trouble, you can see there's a nice symmetry between declining levels of testosterone and declining crime levels. And so this is one thing that's theorized. Another thing that's theorized, we talked about this last time as well, is that crime requires some strength and dexterity. And as you get older, you are not quite as strong and nimble. So when I was 17, I think I would have felt fairly confident that I could outrun any cop in his 30s, especially if he's in his uniform, and I bet I could outrun most cops. When I'm 35, I doubt I could outrun most cops. So if running to get away is part of the calculus that I make in my head about whether or not I'm going to commit a burglary, then the costs exceed the benefits for the 35-year-old would-be criminal, but not for the 17-year-old would-be criminal. The same is true with respect to drugs and alcohol. Younger people can metabolize alcohol far better than older people. When I was 25 years old, I could hold my liquor a lot better than I can now that I'm 53. Now, if I'm out with friends and I decide to have that third beer or that third cocktail, I'm making a conscious decision. And that decision is that I'm going to sacrifice tomorrow for fun tonight because I'm going to wake up with a headache. The other thing is, when you get a lot of people, when they get older, if you drink, it just makes you tired. So lots of bad things happen when you're drunk. Lots of bad things happen when you're drunk. And to the extent that people in their 50s or 40s aren't as good at getting drunk as people in their 20s, can't tolerate alcohol the way they used to, they're less susceptible to the bad things that will happen when they're drunk. Same thing for marijuana. A lot of people quit smoking marijuana because being high stops being fun. That when you were 21, 22 years old, you used to laugh and listen to music and enjoy food. But when you're in your mid-30s and you smoke marijuana, you have introspective head trips that are filled with paranoia and thoughts of mortality, and just stops being pleasant. Now, that's not true for everybody. Some people can continue to metabolize alcohol just fine into their old age. Some people continue to smoke pot into their old age. But it's definitely true that use of drugs declines with age, and drug use, intoxication, and crime go together like peanut butter and jelly. So most criminologists outside sociology tend to like these kinds of explanations, that the nature of the organism changes, that when people get older, they're less inclined to commit crime naturally. One reason why they think that is because the age crime curve is invariant. So if you take two groups, a high crime group and a low crime group, even within the high crime group and the low crime group, you see that the age effect is there. So for instance, imagine here that the high crime group is men, the low crime group is gender, the age crime curve is still in effect. If you look at it in terms of a high crime city like New Orleans and a low crime city like Fargo, North Dakota, even in the low crime city, most of the crime is going to be committed by people who are under age 30, in the crimogenic years of age 15 to 24. And that's part of the reason why, because it seems to be invariant. It seems to hold true for all kinds of crimes. So it holds true for robbery, it holds true for burglary, it holds true for rape, and across time. You can see data here from 1990 to 2000 and 2010, and you can see clearly that for all these kinds of crimes, which are very different crimes, forcible rape has different motivations than burglary does. Burglary has somewhat different motivations than robbery, and 1990 was a little bit different than 2010 in terms of its culture. Still, the age effect is pretty much invariant, and when it's invariant across time like this, people tend to look to more essential causes. Here you see all different kinds of crimes, some index offenses and some not. Larceny, motor vehicle theft, forgery, embezzlement, murder, rape. All of these crimes seem to conform to the age crime curve. This is 2012 data, and as you can see, a very large drop-off once people get into their 30s. Now, here's some data going back way back. These are people who have dug through old town records from villages in Europe. Here's Mantova in the late 16th century, Amsterdam in the 18th century, southern France in the late 18th century, and what you see is remarkable congruence here, that the offenders were all, this is exactly what the data looked like for 2018. And because this effect is so invariant across time, people say, well, how could it be the culture? How could it be socialization? Do you think the socialization in the United States in 2018 is the same as the socialization in Amsterdam in the 17th century? That just doesn't make any sense at all. It must be something about the property of the individual's biology. One of the things that criminologists talk about is that analogous behaviors also have the same kind of age-related property. So one of the things we know for sure is that the characteristics of crime perpetrators are the same as the characteristics of crime victims. The people who are most at risk for committing crime are also at risk from being crime victims. And as you can see from this chart, young people, ages 15 to 29, 15 to 24, are vastly more likely to be victimized than you would expect for their share of the population. And here we see that marijuana use, if you look at the past year prevalence, the royal green, and the past month prevalence, or the seaweed green lines, those both peak around 20 and then start to decline. So as I mentioned earlier, drug use is at its highest when crime is at its highest. And the same is true for alcohol, that drinking peaks in the early 20s and then declines precipitously, and alcohol is closely associated with crime. And so all of these things combine to prompt many criminologists to say that there's just something about getting older that mellows people out. And so that's the relationship between age and crime.